Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's session, Records Management Using the Retention Schedule with University Archivist Matthew Lyons. We have some other really great sessions scheduled for the spring term, and I encourage you to check them out on our events calendar to get all the details. And I'll drop that link into chat right now. So before we get started, I just wanted to run through the kind of standard housekeeping items. First of all, we are recording this session, and I will send a link to the video later this week once I've posted it to our YouTube channel. We ask that you stay muted throughout the session, and you can enter questions in chat or we can take them at the end. And I think that's it for me, so I will turn it over to you, Matthew. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Stacy. And I am going to share my screen and I will start the slideshow. Let's see. There we go. Okay. All right. So, hello, everybody. As Stacy said, I'm Matthew Lyons. I am the Drexel University Archivist. And this webinar is the second in a two-part series on records management. In the first part, which is available as a recording, I talked about records management's basic principles and concepts. In this webinar, I will be talking about more of the specifics on how to implement records management policy. So let's start with, oops. There we go. Let's start with a quick overview of what I'm going to cover in this session. I will briefly review some of the basic concepts from the first part, and then I will take a look at Drexel's records retention schedule and give you several examples of how to read it and apply it. Then I will talk about the different roles and responsibilities within departments as spelled out by the university's records management policy. I'll outline some basic considerations for proper storage of records and proper destruction of records when the time comes to get rid of them. I'll explain the special situation known as litigation discovery when destruction of records is suspended because of a lawsuit or legal investigation. I will talk about archival transfers of historical records and how documentation of the university's history relies on collaboration between the institutional archives units and departments across the university. I will tell you where you can get more information about records management at Drexel, and then I certainly would be happy to answer questions. So let's start with some basic concepts. An organization has a records management policy to help ensure that institutional records are stored, managed, and disposed of consistently, appropriately, and in accordance with the law, and that documentation of the organization's history is preserved for long-term use. Records management policies delineate different kinds of institutional records. For example, active records are those that are being used in the ordinary course of business, which might last for a day or it might last for decades, while inactive records are no longer in regular use, but need to be retained for a specific period of time, which is called the retention period, usually some number of years. For each inactive record, there's supposed to be one department or office, and only one, that holds onto the record for its retention period. And that office is called the custodian of record. The records retention schedule is a big table that lists the retention period and the custodian of record for each of the many different types of records that have been identified. At Drexel, the Office of General Counsel oversees records management, but everybody who conducts business on behalf of the university is responsible for helping to implement it. Let's look at Drexel's records retention schedule, which is available on the OGC website. It's 43 pages long, and it has listings for several hundred different records types. This is a snapshot from page 1. The schedule has 5 columns. At the left is the general category column, which includes things like academic, accounting and finance, health and safety. The next column is specific category, which under the general category of academic includes things like academic administration, admissions, and curriculum and instruction. The third column, type of record, represents the most detailed level, and this is really the column you would use to look up the retention guidelines for the particular records you're interested in. For each type of record, we then have a specific custodian of record and a specific record retention period designated in the 2 columns at the right. Now let's take a closer look at some examples. This is a detail from page 9 of the retention schedule, which shows the top few listings and leaves out the 2 left-hand columns so that we can zoom in a bit more. All of these listings are in the general category of accounting and finance, and within that, the specific category of payroll. So on the first line, we see that for payroll deduction authorization forms, the custodian of record is the payroll office, and the retention period is 7 years. Skipping 2 lines down from there, we see that for time cards and timesheets, the custodian of record is the controller's office, and they are to be retained for only 3 years. Oops. Having trouble with advance. There we go. All right. This is some more examples, and this is from the corporate and governance general category. Here we see on line 1 that a college's accreditation final reports and terminations are to be kept permanently, while the accreditation supporting records on the next line are to be kept either for the length of time stated by the accrediting agency or for 2 accreditation cycles, whichever is longer. In both cases, the custodian of record is the unit that's responsible for meeting the accreditation requirements. One last example, under the category of human subject research. Here we see a listing that includes various types of records related to human research, such as administrative correspondence, research data, safety reports, and so on and so on. The custodian of record for all of these is the principal investigator's department, whichever one that is. But the guidance given here for retention period is complicated, and it depends on a number of factors, such as the research protocols used, whether the research was overseen by the FDA, whether the research subjects were children, and so on. This complexity probably reflects the fact that research on human subject is more heavily regulated than most university activities and is more heavily loaded with ethical concerns and safeguards. One of the biggest records management challenges most of us face is not keeping records too long. As a rule, once a record is no longer active, meaning once it is no longer needed for conducting regular university business, the only department that should be keeping the record is the custodian of record designated in the retention schedule. The custodian of record is usually, but not always, the office that created it. And as a rule, once the retention period has been completed, all copies of the record should be disposed of, with some exceptions. One exception is if the record has long-term historical value, in which case it should be transferred to either the University Archives or the College of Medicine Legacy Center archives. Another exception is if records destruction has been suspended because of litigation. I'll talk about both of these exceptions a little bit more later on. Now I'm going to outline some of the more specific records management responsibilities. Under Drexel's records management policy, each department, which in this case means each academic, clinical, or administrative office at whatever level within the university, each department is responsible for a number of functions. These responsibilities include having an indexing system for its records, protecting confidential information, responding to records requests, storing records appropriately, maintaining records for the required period of time, and destroying records at the end of their retention period, unless they have long-term historical value and are candidates for transfer to the archives. Within each within each university office, the records management policy defines two distinct roles: department head and records management administrator. The department head has overall responsibility to ensure compliance with the policy, to develop suitable practices and procedures for implementing it, and to designate one or more records management administrators. The department head can take on the role of records management administrator themselves. They can designate somebody else, or they can designate multiple records management administrators if the department is large or complex. While a department head has overall oversight, a records management administrator is responsible for more of the day-to-day or details of implementing the policy. The administrator coordinates the retention, preservation, and destruction of designated records. They implement physical storage practices, indexing, and special protection for confidential materials. And they coordinate responses to records requests and litigation hold notices. The records management policy also spells out some of these functions in more detail. For physical storage practices, it says that records must be stored in ways that keep them free from pests, from fire, smoke, or water damage, and from magnetic damage for digital media. Confidential information must be stored securely for both active and inactive records. The policy also gives details on how to carry out records destruction. The appropriate destruction methods depend on how sensitive the records are. If they're not confidential, paper records can simply be recycled and electronic files can be deleted. But if they do contain confidential information, they need to be shredded, or for electronic media, they need to be fully sanitized by IT professionals. And all destruction needs to be halted if the department receives a litigation hold notice. I've referred to litigation discovery and litigation hold a couple of times. Basically, the university has a responsibility to preserve evidence that's needed in a court case. So if the university is involved in a lawsuit, or there's the threat of a lawsuit, or a legal investigation, it has to immediately stop all destruction of records that might be used as evidence. In this kind of situation, the Office of General Counsel issues a litigation hold notice that describes the type of records involved and the specific departments or employees that are affected. The OGC has a whole policy about this that's available on their website. Another important part of records management is archival transfers. Under Drexel's records management policy, there's a category called historical records, which means records that are considered to have long-term value in documenting the structure, activities, or scholarly output of the university. These records are not supposed to be destroyed once their retention period is over. Instead, they are to be transferred to one of the institutional archives, either university archives or the College of Medicine Legacy Center archives. Both of these archives rely on academic and administrative departments to reach out to us. Neither the records management policy nor the retention schedule gives specifics on which records are historical records. and there's no automatic mechanism for selecting them or transferring them. So if you or your department have records that you think might have long-term historical value, or if you just want to get more information about the kinds of records we're interested in, please contact the staff at one of the archives. We will be happy to talk with you about the records you work with and how they relate to our collecting policies and priorities. Let me now summarize a few key takeaways from this presentation. The records retention schedule lists the custodian of record and retention period for hundreds of record types. That means after a record has become inactive, the schedule spells out which unit has sole responsibility for keeping that record and how long they should keep it for. We should keep inactive records long enough and not too long. That means in most cases, the retention period is both a floor and a ceiling. If the retention period is 3 years, say, that means don't get rid of the record before 3 years past the point when it becomes inactive, but don't keep it longer than 3 years past that point. Each unit is responsible for storing, indexing, and disposing of the inactive records for which it is the custodian. And within each unit, the department head has overall records management responsibility, while the records management administrator manages the implementation details. Methods for storing records need to keep confidential information secure and protect against damage due to pests, water, fire, electromagnetic forces, etc. Destruction methods depend on the format, particularly paper versus digital formats, and on the content, with confidential information requiring more rigorous and irreversible destruction methods. And lastly, the University Archives and the College of Medicine Legacy Center archives depend on all of the other departments in the university to help preserve the institution's history. So please work with us to identify which of your records have long-term historical value and should be transferred to one of the archives. If you would like more information, the Office of General Counsel website is where you can find Drexel's records management policy, the records retention schedule, an FAQs page, and a training video. At the OGC, Associate General Counsel Tammy Weibel is the point person for records management, and she is happy to both answer questions and to work with departments to help them figure out how to implement records management in a way that works for everybody. For additional information, you can also check out the University Archives section of the Drexel University Libraries website, where you can find various records management pages with tips on how to create a records guide for your department, how to manage email, how to replace your paper records with digital, and how to destroy expired records appropriately. That concludes my presentation, and now I would be happy to answer questions if anyone has them, and I am going to leave that page up for a moment. Well, I guess I will just exit here.
Does anybody have any questions? You are more than welcome to unmute or type in the chat.
Okay, I do have a couple questions. If the retention period is up, obviously there's some records where like there's a legal obligation to destroy it, but in the case where there is not a legal obligation, where it's not actually sensitive material, like I guess an example I'm looking at is like, you know, annual reports, like once they're submitted, like, you know, 7 years after filing the report, the department responsible for creating the record is supposed to, like, that's the 7 years is how long they're supposed to keep it. But like, is there like, is that like, you know, kind of the minimum amount of time they have to keep it, but they don't have to destroy it in that case if they have some other reason to keep it around?
I think that that question kind of goes back to the question of what's an active record and what's an inactive record. Mm-hmm. I would say that an annual report is an example of a document that people in a number of different departments around the university might have occasion to refer back to several years later. Mm-hmm. And so even though that doesn't mean they're using the record day to day, or, there may be very long intervals in between uses, I would still consider that an active record if it's something that they feel that it's useful to keep on hand for potential use. But if it's something that really doesn't relate to their operations and isn't something that they're likely to see as being a useful reference source, then it's probably no longer active, and then probably doesn't make sense for them to retain it if they're not the custodian of record.
So then to follow up, I mean, unless I'm missing something, it doesn't look like the PDF of the retention schedule clearly indicates when it's a legal obligation, when you ought to destroy things, and when it's like, at this is the minimum amount of time you have to keep it. So maybe it would be helpful to make that clear, or something, at least in the cases where it's like very definite.
Right. Well, it's true that the retention schedule doesn't delineate between the different reasons for the retention period that's given. Sometimes it's a legal requirement or government regulation. Sometimes it's some other reason, such as just institutional policy or best practices in a particular area of operations. And I don't know, just looking at the retention schedule, which it's going to be. I could make some inferences. So I suspect that certain kinds of financial records are more likely to be subject to specific government regulations, and also certain kinds of research records, such as the human subject research related records that I referred to in the presentation. Whereas a lot of other things, I think it's probably just a question of institutional practice.
Yeah, I guess, and some things are like, it is obvious, but some things may or may not be self-evident. So.
Yep.
Yeah, that was my question.
Yeah, actually, Simon, you scooped my question. Mine was gonna be about it's basically what you had asked, but focusing more on, like, I had seen that there were some that actually did cite an external organization or government law of some sort, but then some of them were just like 3 years, 7 years, and there was nothing that I remember seeing that cited why it is that length. And then so I was kind of curious as to like who decided that, and so Matthew, as you say, it's mostly just a best practice sort of a thing, or just sort of maybe something somebody internally maybe arbitrarily decided so that it wasn't indefinite.
Yeah, I mean, I know that the OGC staff did a lot of research in developing the retention schedule, which involved certainly talking with representatives of a lot of different units within the university, as well as looking at the practices of peer institutions and the kinds of records management practices that other universities have.
Makes sense.
Yeah, but I don't know how much of the decisions are documented or spelled out as far as what the reasons were for a particular choice.
Okay, that was my question, and but I just want to say thanks for the presentation. That was very informative. Appreciate it.
Very welcome.
Any other questions for Matthew before we wrap up for the day? All right. Then thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you at a future libraries event. And I'll share the recording shortly.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.